All right, so today we're going to be looking at Russia, a little bit before World War One, what was going on in World War One or during World War One, and the revolutions that took place that ultimately not only overthrew the Tsar with the imperial family of the Romanovs, but then led to Lenin taking charge and eventually becoming the Soviet Union, which finally leads to Stalin taking over, which will then bring us into World War Two. So before we get into kind of World War One and what was going on there, we need to have a look at the background of the structure of Russia, and kind of look at the social and political nature of things. So one of the basic aspects of their political structure was that the ruler was a Tsar, which essentially was emperor of Russia, and the imperial family were the Romanovs at the time of World War One, and they're going to be the last imperial family that are going to be overthrown with the revolutions. So looking at the other structure that was going on is that ultimately Russia was behind most Western civilizations at the time, both not only in industrialization, but socially as well. And this is going to lead to several issues for them as they try to move into, let's call it the modern world, catch up with the other Western societies that were ahead. So you do have behind an industrialization. And this is going to become problematic, especially with World War One, which was beginning to use a lot of the new modern technology and requiring of industrialized input or output for that. The other thing, of course, is that, world powers at this time were gauging their success as well as their power within the world based on industrialization. And so Russia was looking to join that group of people and those nations and pushed for increase of industrial output, and all of that's going to become problematic over time. The other part has to do with social structure, and they still practiced until 1861. They were practicing serfdom or used serfdom. Now, serfdom is something that in most of the areas in the Western world ended in the end of the Middle Ages. What serfdom is the idea, it's a form of feudalism, and it's a concept where landless peasants serve a nobility or a lord, right? And the lord is the one that has a manor or property, is basically what it is. And the peasants live at the manor, and then they are the ones that are doing the farming. The problem with this is that they aren't being paid and they aren't being treated well. They're serfs. And serfs are real close to slavery, if not a form of slavery. You're tied to the land. And you rarely have the opportunity to be able to leave in those situations. So for all intents and purposes, it's a type of slavery. The difference between like serfs and slaves is that serfs are tied to the land and they stay with the land, where slaves are bought and sold and moved around independently of any kind of land or property concept. But as far as conditions and treatment and freedom, it was relatively non-existent for their freedom, and conditions were usually poor. Serfs rarely did more than barely survive. So they took until 1861 to abolish serfdom, and they were behind in industrialization as well. Then the other problem that emerges for them is because there's this push for industrialization, you have a massive growth between 1890 and 1910 of population boom in major cities. And this becomes problematic because they were not prepared for managing, and much like with industrialization in other nations as well, they weren't prepared for the massive increase in population. And so when you have populations that double in size between this period, and lack of infrastructure, what ends up happening is you have major issues with overcrowding, a lack of work and homes for people, and usually general poor living conditions, which includes lack of food. And this will be a part of the revolutions and the issues that emerge because of this. So that's the background that sets the scene then for one of the first revolutions, which took place in 1905. The revolution of 1905 came about because of this transformation that was going on in the Russian Empire with the czars, and the rapid rise of industrialization, which created this tension between workers and the wealthy. And in part, not just the wealthy, but a resentment for the czar as a position and the Romanovs as a family. And that's because they represented wealth and opulence compared to the suffering of the workers. And of course, because they also, the Tsar Nicholas was in charge of the country. And so there was a target towards Nicholas specifically. Later, it's going to be towards his wife as well. And what happens is the workers decided to have a demonstration and protest. And they decided to do a series of marches. And one of the marches was, and this went on, this wasn't just one protest and demonstration. These protests and demonstrations had been going on for a while. In 1905, it was on January of the 22nd of 1905, they decided to march to what was the Winter Palace to protest, probably to Nicholas specifically, right? This is one of the palaces of the Romanovs. So they marched to the Winter Palace and were met by the palace guards, who did not respond well to the protesters, and they ended up firing on the protesters. This led to over 130 people being killed, and more than that being wounded, and hundreds wounded. Now, the thing that was dumb about this situation, it became known as Bloody Sunday, which of course is not a good name to have attached for the Romanovs at all. The thing that was stupid about this is that Nicholas was not even there. So, one, he didn't order the guards to fire on the protesters. They didn't have a justification of firing for fear of his safety. He wasn't present at that palace, so there was no reason to fire on the crowd outside of the in the moment fear of a large group and just general incompetence of the guards. This led to the kind of indignation of the treatment of workers. It reinforced the idea that the Romanovs and the position of Tsar were out of touch with the people, which is not going to bring them down at this point, but it is that's going to continue to fester and stay into the later revolution in 1917 that's going to overthrow the family. And it is going to lead to a series of changes, though, because of this, because then you end up getting the title Bloody Sunday. It's put into the newspapers. It did create a break between many of the workers who initially had protested, while they were having some issues, were still loyal to Nicholas. After this event, even though technically it was slightly unfair to him as he had nothing to do directly with this event, many began to pull away and stop supporting the position of Tsar. This led to increasing pressure for Nicholas to make changes. And so he attempted in March to make some conciliations in order to appease the people. And what he ended up doing is he said that he would provide religious tolerance, which was always one of tension in Russia and will continue to be through the Soviet Union, and actually even somewhat today. He did repeal some legislation against ethnic minorities in Russia, which also always faced abuse and discrimination in Russia. That was a long-standing issue at that time. And then said that he would take advice on a government structure, which was kind of a vague promise of not much. The thing with this is it did appease some, but ultimately for many this was not enough. And so this continued to lead to continued protest, and it encompassed a wide variety of the population, right? This had started out as workers, but had spread to students as well, and general what was seen as peasant unrest. And workers that were not just farmers and rural, but ultimately industry-based city living workers that felt that they were also being treated unfairly within the factories that had been pushed to increase productivity to try to move Russia up into the more modern world. This then led to continued demonstrations and eventually vandalism and violence. So all of this created tensions with the people and the Romanovs and the position of Tsar itself. And that's going to then come on the heel of in the future of World War I, which is just going to create additional problems within that structure. So after that, and after the continued issues with the demonstrations, you end up having the Imperial Manifesto, which was in August 19th. And this was in response essentially to saying that he hadn't gone far enough. Those concessions are fine, but that's not going to cut it. And because the protests continued, because vandalism and violence were continuing, and it became clear that people were not dissatisfied with Nicholas, he ended up creating an elective Duma. And a Duma is essentially a representative assembly, which is a big deal, because the czars had absolute authority. And so to now create a government system that was a representative assembly was an initial step of suggesting of limiting the czar's power. Now, it's not going to end up going this way, because Nicholas is going to just repeal the Duma whenever he doesn't like the decisions they make. But in theory, when he first put it out there, it should have seemed like a good idea, because it was offering some limitations and consultative powers to suggest that there would be a check and balance on the czar power, which is a big deal for an absolute government, right? We saw that in the past, if you look at with France, and Louis XIV and absolutism. Absolute rulers don't like to give up power and authority. This ultimately failed to satisfy the masses in large, and this continued. So they weren't fully happy with this, and by this point were having revolutionaries that were agitating the masses, and so even those that were or might have been satisfied at the time were being goaded, and we'll say stoking the fire. We're instigating a lot of the discontent. And it's around this time within these revolutions that you have the emergence of the Bolsheviks. And this is going to be the party that Lenin is going to join, which is with the Social Democrats. And they're going to press for change. You also had what were called the Social Revolutionaries, and they were even more radical at the time, and were seen as anarchists. And they were definitely the ones that advocated the violence and attacks. So you had a kind of two different groups that were putting pressure and stoking and instigating discontent among the people, even after these imperial manifestos and changes were being made. During this time, you had a continuation of general strikes, and one of the largest massive strikes that took place really anywhere at the time. Continue of generation of general strikes, and this then coalesced into a massive strike where everyone joined together, at which lasted from the October 20th to 30th. October 20th to 30th. What was noteworthy of this strike in particular compared to just general strikes as they take place is that what makes a strike effective is you have to have a large enough force supporting a strike that it impacts whatever you're targeting. So when people call boycotts are an example of this. If you call for a boycott and say we're going to boycott these goods, but only a small minority boycott those goods, it largely doesn't impact that company or whatever topic negatively to make any change. And then if you have a larger strike where it does impact them negatively, like say economically, it has to last to force change. So strikes and boycotts and things like that are notoriously hard to be effective unless you have a large enough, cohesive enough force that is following through. And in this case, the October strikes really, it seemed to, the appearance of this and certainly the size was that the Russian people were acting with a single will, essentially, that they were all working together to move towards change. And that then can have a significant impact on demanding or forcing people to change when you realize that it seems that it's bringing things to a standstill. Acted in a single will. This led to, both with the popularity and the continued indication that people were not going to be content with the current structure, is that they you have that they created the union. They formed a large union for workers, which was a big deal for workers' rights, because workers' rights in Russia were pretty much non-existent. And then worked towards setting up strikes against the owners, factories, all of that. And this essentially, why it was effective is that it basically paralyzed Russia because it was so large. It paralyzed the factories, the economy, travel, and that led to the October Manifesto. So this is where it's effective, right? If you have a large enough population and they stick with it, then it can make change, but it's just hard. It's why you see so many strikes and boycotts that happen and nothing changes, is that it really does require a massive population of one that is willing to stick with and continue pushing forward for a significant period in time, that it has such an impact that it forces change. So then Nicholas announced that the Duma, which he, again, was a big step just of itself, but he called it consultative powers, would be a full and true legislative body. And then that meant that he did have limitations to his powers, not in just early, appearance, and the first one would have probably had some, because they could have put stuff forth, they could be putting pressure on him, but the reality is that it wasn't a full-fledged constitutional monarchy. And then he promised that so they would be able to pass laws and reject laws as well, and there would be continued expansion in the future. And so this was significant because it created, as I said, an actual constitutional monarchy. And with a constitutional monarchy, you do have significant limitations on the king. Again, some felt this was good, others didn't. But it holds people off for a while, and until World War I. So what comes next then is World War I, and Russia ends up in World War I, and they end up as the most unprepared of all of the nations that were part of the war. And this has to do with the fact, of course, that they were behind in industrialization, and resources. And while Russia always has the manpower, but they lacked resources and industrialization. And with a war that required that, because of course industrialization allows for weapons and equipment, which was going to be necessary to win the war, or at least function in the war. And to give an example of how problematic this was, is that gas warfare in World War I was more psychologically damaging to soldiers than it was actually damaging. Now, and again, as I mentioned before when we talked about gas warfare, don't get me wrong, it was horrible and it could kill people and permanently maim people. But there were tactics that were learned on how to largely mitigate the impact of gas warfare. However, gas warfare was pretty effective on Russia. And the reason that it was effective on Russia when it wasn't on everyone else is they did not have the resources to have proper gas masks. And that was both the money as well as the technology to create them. And if you don't have proper gas masks, then the gas, obviously, you inhale more of it. You're going to have higher death rate, far higher of permanently injured soldiers, and other defenses for protecting against gas warfare. And that was just one example of it, of where it became problematic. They also lacked proper weapons, not just proper weapons, but enough weapons. Now, this is interesting as terms of this becomes a problem again in World War II, where Russian soldiers would be given one soldier, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, specifically Russia, and the attack on Stalingrad, one soldier would be given a rifle, the other soldier behind them would be given extra ammo. The soldier with the extra ammo was to follow behind the soldier with the rifle and ammo, and when he was killed, then you were to pick up the rifle. So they were sending soldiers in without rifles, and that was in World War II. Right, but that was still a problem that they were trying to catch up on, because they lacked proper weapons. Not only proper weapons, but I just wrote enough, but not enough weapons as well. The other issue was food resources, both during the war and at home. So when you have people that end up hungry, that usually leads to discontent when all of that. And then you had a push by Nicholas for increased industrial output because, of course, they needed it. But forced industrial output that was mandated by Nicholas creates its own problems. So if all of the resources, one, you're forcing people to work in jobs they don't want to do. And also jobs. Let me get that down here. It was also in poor conditions. In some cases, very small pay. All under the guise of a need for, because of war. And this also leads to a decline in agricultural production, which they couldn't afford. because you had been moving so many people to industrial production to increase output, which did double, so it was successful in doubling their industrial output, but you had a massive decline in agricultural production, which of course is going to be problematic with people then once again not having food, which is going to create discontent. The other issue that took place is that the Tsar Nicholas went to fight on the front lines, which in of itself isn't a bad thing and actually seems like a good thing to have a leader leading by example, although this was done with a protest by the government, who suggested commanding the troops from the front lines when you had discontent at home. Left you open for criticism, for people taking advantage of your absence, which is exactly what happened. So, the Tsar was not a horrible person. He wasn't the best leader. He wasn't the worst leader. Unfortunately, he made poor decisions. And that led to, and in this case, his, reasoning was, not a bad thing. He wanted to go serve on the front lines to show that he was with his people, that he wasn't sending them out to die without him being willing to fight as well. And that's a noble thing. Unfortunately, like I said, there with all the other problems that were going on, it leaves a country ripe for takeover, which is exactly what's going to happen. This coincides with what's probably the most fascinating story about the Romanov family, which is his wife, Alexandra, who wasn't particularly well liked, and Rasputin. Rasputin was an advisor for the Romanov family. Their son, Alexei, had hemophilia, the blood disease. And as they just called it the blood disease, right? So he bled really easily. And Rasputin claimed, so Rasputin was an advisor. He was not liked at all. He was both kind of seen as someone who was into mysticism, kind of connected to religious ideas, but with his own weird mysticism connected to it. He kind of became the boogeyman for Russia, and also the one to blame. And what happens is he definitely had his own political purposes and desires, and he used Nicholas's absence to his advantage in order to gain political, not control, but political power. Right, so he's not the one that took over, but people did not like him. The Russian nobles did not like him. The general population saw him as either weird, taking advantage of the Romanovs, or a heretic, and all of that became problematic. So this then leads to where Alexandra, potentially under the advisement of Rasputin, while her husband was gone, began firing elected officials, which of course was seen as a threat to the Duma. And this didn't help that, as I mentioned, that Nicholas had in the past just ignored the Duma when he didn't like what they did. So you already had tensions with the Duma's authority and how secure it was. And then while he's gone, you have Alexandra firing elected officials, which is not what she was supposed to do. And that continues to create this increased threat. This led to rumors of an affair, that she was having an affair with Rasputin. And all of these things, the fact that he was horribly unliked, the fact that they saw him as trying to take over, Russian nobles ended up hatching a plan. It wasn't even much of a plan, who were eager to end his influence over Alexandra. decided to kill him. And they murdered him. And it's an interesting story with that. And that was on December 30th of 1916. Now, how much is fact or fiction in this story, is for debate. But supposedly, the story goes at first that they tried to poison him, then they shot him, and then apparently drowned him. And then there were rumors that he didn't actually drown, that he froze to death in the river. And of course, there's various rumors. It took him the story became that it took him a long time to die, which then, of course, just enhanced this idea that he was dealing in magic and illicit arts, if you will, right? That how did he survive all of these attempts on his life? It all happened at the same time. Like, it wasn't over a period of time. There's other stories in history of people trying to kill people over time and trying all these methods and failing. They poisoned him. When that didn't work, the same day they shot him, and then when it seemed to not work for that, they threw him into the river. And then the story goes that supposedly later, when they fished his body out of the river, they did an autopsy, and it was that he froze to death rather than drown. But again, how reliable that is, there's been other articles that have come out and said no, he was shot and he died. No, but the story is important because it tells you that the mystery around him and this idea that he somehow was dealing in magic is where you get the Disney's Anastasia with the Rasputin character, where he's like, it was one of the scariest scenes when I was a kid. I liked Anastasia, but that scene with Rasputin scared the crap out of me, because he's like in the underworld with this fire and flame and all of this crazy concoctions and whatever. And I just remember that being, as a kid, being so scary. That's where that comes from, though. Where, I mean, of course, Disney's never accurate historically, but they take a lot of their movies are from, they take little historical nuggets and then make it what they want. But that is where that rumor and that kind of idea of that's who Rasputin came from, these stories of his death. And so what you have then is that many Russians lost trust in the Tsar after this. And the government was corrupt. Even the Duma had problems. That, so it's all the combination of all of this. After his death, and then the troubles and lack of food during World War I. Here we'll go. The abdication of Tsar Nicholas. So it was all of these combinations of things. The corrupt government, Nicholas not being present, Nicholas off in front lines of war rather than at home. So being away, right? People going hungry, the lack of food, the scandal, supposedly, whether there was any, it's mostly believed that she wasn't having an affair, but the scandal of the affair, and of course, the general scandal of Alexandra actions with the government, all of this stuff, right, then led to more protests. You get the protests again and again with that. And the people were once again protesting on the streets. They were protesting for food and work, but it was largely about the lack of food. And once again, this time police fired on the crowd. So they didn't learn from the Imperial Guard on the first protest. This led to mass protest. Right, you had protests going on, but it led to even further protest, and that forced. What the Duma did is that they formed a provisional government. And with the formation of the provisional government and the protests, this then led to Nicholas abdicating, which then was the end of the Romanov dynasty and imperial Russia. It's not going to be the end of the Romanovs. Let's see. We'll just keep it with the abdication part of it. What ends up happening, we're going to go back in time in just a minute to talk about Lenin and his background and then how he comes into play with all of this. But what happens is after he abdicates, there's a lot of discussion about what to do with him. Like, there was fear that they would try to take back control, that supporters of the Tsar as a position, the Romanovs as a family, would lead to a revolt to put them back in charge. And so they are moved around a lot. Initially, here, well, actually, let's put it as what leads to the Romanov assassinations. So initially, they're moved around a lot, and for their safety. There was concern, of course, that they were potentially not safe, and they were moved around. They had an opportunity to leave. Well, they kind of had an opportunity. There was an offer that then was rescinded, which could have saved their lives, but it was a very small window of time when they had the freedom where they could have left Russia. And the reality is when they initially started, they had their freedom, but were moving around. That moved to house arrest. And they were under house arrest for a while, where they were moved from place to place, but they were no longer in control. And then under Lenin's direction, once he takes over, he ultimately decides to have them killed. But they don't, there was huge discussion, right, publicly or not, and whether it was just going to be Nicholas who would be put on trial, or whether it was better to just get rid of the whole family. And ultimately they decided it was better to quietly get rid of the family. And so in the last place where they were being held as under house arrest, essentially, and by this point they were in a smaller house. They didn't have the luxury they were used to anymore. There was a few servants that were still with them that were loyal to them, and then it was the family. They were shot and killed. Now, why this became a whole thing about whether Anastasia was still alive is that because it was meant to be quiet and not let people know. Their bodies were attempted to be destroyed and buried where people wouldn't find them. So the secret, right, led to rumors, specifically with Anastasia. And why just her? She was the youngest daughter, and so there was some argument that people couldn't kill her. There was other situations with this. So we'll look at this, and I'll finish telling the story of what happened with that. So you have here, right, this is the Romanov family, with this is Nicholas, and then the youngest son, Alexei, and then Anastasia was the youngest daughter. And here is a good example of, like I said, the wealth and luxury, which they did live and were somewhat opulent, and that rubbed people the wrong way. Here was with the revolution of 1905, where you see the guards. They actually have a picture of them shooting the people who were protesting, which led to the beginning of a domino effect of discontent. And I mean, very much so with the guards, right? It's unarmed people. They're not attacking. And that was part of the issue, is that it was an unprovoked attack. Here you even have, and there's also, I mean, that people had started to leave by this point, but they were not a scary crowd. The February Revolution 1917 was much, much larger, with the protests, with the marches, with the organization, right? This was very much organized protests, right? And this is where you had the unions that were working on it. If you go back to the 1905, right, this was more spur of the moment, and less organized. It wasn't the same level of push for change. And you can just see by the sheer number of people in this. Here are the Romanovs when they were imprisoned with their servants. You can't, it's, the picture isn't great quality, but you can see the difference of, like, look at their clothing. Right, that you have the family picture and the other portraits, if you look at it, where it's luxury versus, they're not in rags, but they're no longer in that life of luxury that they were living before. And then this is the remnants of the room. It's the same room in this picture, which I think was taken not too long before they were executed. And here you have the room where the investigators actually dug out the bullets in the wall to try to figure out what had happened. We'll come back to that one there. So the story with this was that, if we go back to this for just a second, that throughout their stay, Maria and Anastasia had started flirting with the guards, right? Because they're older than that earlier picture I showed where they were really young. But she was still the youngest daughter here, and here's Alexei. And that they had started flirting with the guards, and the guards had talked about maybe helping the two girls escape. And they had faced hardships before this, when they were taken on a train to this final house where they were killed, and they were treated pretty roughly. There was suggestion that at least one of the older daughters, if not two of them, were raped, and certainly sexually assaulted. And the oldest daughter apparently fell into kind of a depression after that event, even though they were reunited. But Maria and Anastasia apparently started flirting with the guards in hopes of potentially maybe finding a way out. And they did. They had talked about letting the girls escape. The other thing that the family had done apparently is, under their clothing, the kids they'd sewn in the family jewels, which apparently was quite a fortune, into the lining of their underwear. So that if they could fund an escape or bribe if they needed it. So when the order finally came through to execute him, the guards locked the room, locked these doors here, and they were all supposed to shoot at the different family members to kill them, and then the servants were killed as well. But apparently the soldiers were hesitant to kill the children. So most aimed at Nicholas and his wife. Nonetheless, it became super chaotic. The guards, some of the guards were injured and shooting each other. The other problem was those jewels that were in their underwear and bras became somewhat like a bulletproof vest. Not perfect. They were still shot and wounded. But some of the kids didn't die, one, because they weren't shooting a lot at them, but two, when they were, that it protected some of it. And so then you had, most of the family was not dead when the shooting was over. Everyone was lying down, dying or injured, blood everywhere, and then they ended up having to go and stab them to death to finish it off. So it was this horribly messy, brutal murder that took place that was not going the way that it was supposed to be planned. Then they went to go bury him, and the location that they were going to go bury him ended up not being deep enough for the the graves, and the main guy that had been in charge of this had to go back and forth into town to get supplies to try to dissolve their bodies, and they smashed up their skulls to try to make sure that they weren't identified, and then buried them in 2 different locations. So this secretive hush hush thing where they kind of just disappeared. The rumors of the guards who were there that had participated in the murder did let something slip. And so then there were rumors that a couple of the girls or Anastasia may have gotten away. And just because of all the confusion. And so then that's where those rumors also came from, as far as how Anastasia and from this. And because Lenin, refused to be open about the execution and murders of the family, and only the rumors were trickling out, you had hundreds of imposters throughout the years that claimed to be Anastasia, because that rumor solidified that she had survived. And so then you had people coming and trying to claim that they later were the grown-up Anastasia. Which is crazy, just the whole mystique that got created around that issue. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go back in time just a little bit to look at Lenin, because he becomes one of the main players and obviously the leader of Russia throughout these events. So we're going to start off with his youth, and then look at what his role was in all of this throughout this period. He was born into a relatively wealthy family. So he was not poor or anything like that. His father was university educated civil servant. And, the fact that they were well off and he was educated suggests that. He worked at as a government inspector of schools for the Tsar. So, worked for the Tsar, right? Not imperial family. His mother was the daughter of a wealthy German doctor. And he was the 4th child of 9. So a large family, generally well-off family. His father rose up in the ranks of civil servant to eventually the title that he ended up getting was Your Excellency. I mean, so that's to get the title Your Excellency is really high up in government officials. So they lived a generally good life. His sons were expected to follow in the father's path. There were 2 main events that changed Lenin's trajectory in his life. The first was the death of his father, who they believe had a heart attack. And this seemed to shatter Lenin's religious faith. So he certainly, they were a religious family before, not overly devout or anything, but he was raised with religion, and this seemed to stop his belief and trust in God. And then in 1887, his brother was arrested and accused of plotting to assassinate Alexander III with a bomb. And what I think shook him with this was that his brother didn't deny the charges. He didn't confess to everything, but he refused to deny and protest and claim innocence to bomb, Alexander III. And there was some suggestion that if he had claimed he was innocent, or begged for mercy, that he would have gotten a life in prison rather than being hanged, which he was hanged for attempted assassination. So did not plead innocence and did not beg for mercy. And so this led, like I said, to him being executed. And that led to Lenin beginning to figure out what was his brother's political conviction that made him, not beg for mercy and not try to forsake what he had done. The other issue, of course, was that this also led to the family being under surveillance. And this is going to create a dislike and discontent of the government, and also this is the position of czar. So from these two events, we'll put it under here. He devoted himself to discovering his brother's political convictions, which is going to lead him then down to the path to joining the Bolsheviks, and participating in generally subversive activity against the government. When he was enrolled as a university student, he was expelled for subversive activity, which was vague, but generally it was speaking out against the government and the czar. And again, it didn't help that they were kind of under surveillance. This then was not just speaking out, but protests that he took place in. He then eventually worked to become a lawyer and immersed himself in revolutionary literature. And so this then becomes the period where he has his most active revolutionary activity, and is also going to be constantly in trouble with the government. So after being expelled and really actually digging deeper into the revolutionary activity, he ended up in 1895, he went abroad, and this was in various parts in Europe, specifically to cultivate and learn more about Marxist ideology. And there he really solidified his ideas and policies that would come into play with not only pushing for revolution and change of overthrowing the czar, but when he becomes the leader as well. So Marxist ideology and connections. When he comes back from Europe, he ends up creating the Union of Struggle for the Liberation of the Working Class, which is a very long title for a group. And this was somewhere in between legal and not legal. What they began proposing was not, and not surprisingly, with this, as was common, there were secret police that began going, that went to the meetings, and they arrested him. And they arrested him again because of what then they were talking about in the meetings, as far as not just protest. Oh, nope, there we go. Arrested him for not only protests, but they were planning for violence and vandalism and things like that, along with the language against the czars of Russia. And specifically, what they arrested him for was illegal literature. Which was anti-czar propaganda, and he's going to continue with this. This eventually leads to jail for a year, and then finally exile in Siberia. Now, Siberia becomes notorious with the gulags under Stalin. And while it was not pleasant, Siberia was a harsh place to be. It was not nearly as much as the death camps that Siberia became, the gulags became under Stalin. He actually met his wife in Siberia in exile. And then, funnily enough, he returned just before his 3 years was up, a little early. So he managed to, and this shows again that it wasn't quite a lockdown place. It was a place to send off people that was unpleasant, that was semi-watched, but you kind of lived your life. And that's not what exile in Siberia and the gulags is going to become. But was enough that he could sneak back in, and ended up back in St. Petersburg, technically before he was supposed to be. And so then he threw himself into a new project. Let's see, I guess we're not in 1898 anymore. After his return, and he created a Marxist newspaper called the Iskra, which means the spark. And in order to publish this, because it was technically illegal in Russia, is that he traveled to Germany to produce and publish the newspaper. And then it would be smuggled back into Russia. And this took a lot of his time, and was one of his major projects that he put a lot of his attention and time into. And this was from 1900 to 1903 that he was doing this, right? So this is before the 1905 revolutions. And he ended up becoming a key figure in the Social Democrats. So he rose in ranks of Social Democrats, although from afar. They met in London for one of their second Congress. So they had like the first Congress and the second Congress of the Social Democrats. And they would meet outside of Russia because, again, they were somewhat seen as a revolutionary group that wasn't accepted in Russia. And in 1903, with the Second Congress, he was put into a key position within the party. And this then leads to during events during World War I and after. So we'll move to 5 here. Lenin during World War I and after. He utilized World War I to push revolution, and as we already looked at, right, the conditions and structure of what was going on with Nicholas and Russia at the time helped that position. As well as the popularity of the Social Democrats and then the Bolsheviks specifically. During World War I, they were still recovering from the 1905 revolutions and the various changes in government that Nicholas had to make. And Lenin saw the war as a good thing, because it made people, what he said, become aware of the problems with the Tsar. The quote that he had with this is, "But for the war, Russia could have gone on living for years and decades without revolution against the capitalists." And so he decided to use the conflict to push for political change, as it showcased problems. And so this became the avenue for propaganda against the Tsar and the whole government structure of Russia. He created not only a lot of newspapers, but propaganda posters, speeches. All of these things were then brought into Russia that spoke out against posters, right? The whole point of all of this was to agitate the masses against Nicholas and push for revolution and change. He had a stream of anti-war propaganda towards Russia. He also made contacts with Germany, who of course was looking to maintain chaos in Russia because they were the enemy. So, I mean, technically he was somewhat of a traitor to his country because he was actively working against Russia's benefit for the war. But that was what he saw as the way for him to push change. Now, he ended up becoming trapped in Switzerland due to the war. But he eventually made his way through Germany and denounced the government when it shifted to a provisional government. And so, you know, after the Nicholas abdicates, he also pushed against the provisional government because he saw it as not going far enough. If they had decided to arrest him then, which, you know, they probably should have because he was actively talking about overthrowing them and changing the system, you know, things might have changed significantly different. Instead, they waited for 3 months after he arrived back in Russia. And when they tried 3 months later, he'd gone into hiding. So actively pushed against provisional government, ended up back in Russia. But went into hiding. He then actively laid out and began to consolidate and lay out his political goals. And he had four goals for Russia. He had 4 major goals that he published and gave speeches about. One was that he immediately started criticizing the war. Well, he already had been criticizing the war with the Tsar, but then even with the provisional government, he was criticizing the war with Germany, and it was said that they needed to have immediate peace with Germany. So what's interesting is, right, he lauded the war as a good thing for Russia, but then as he was making a move to gain political power, he changed tactics and said that we need to make peace with Germany. War is bad for Russia. He also said that they needed to redistribute the land to the peasants, which of course pissed off the wealthy, but made him popular with the peasants and working class. Also, and this one also made him popular with the working class. Transfer industrial control to the workers. Right, so that they own the factories and can make their own rules and money. And then what he saw as important for what the government should be is the Soviet, which is where you get the Soviet Union later, that they should be the political power in Russia. So this is what he began advocating and giving speeches for. He used a tagline or slogan in his speeches and essentially rallies, which was, it was with this, right? Peace, land, and bread. And this became very popular slogan that resonated with the people and attracted considerable support. While the provisional government put down the initial revolution, the movement had gained enough support and people that they were able to move forward in seizing control of the factories and the economy in many ways. So gained enough support from population that what they did is that they had people seize the train stations. And so this was an organized overthrow of the provincial government. Not train stations. They took over the electrical plants, which of course controlled the power, and then as well as some of the factories, right, which then controlled production. This is going to lead to civil war between the provisional government and Lenin and the Bolsheviks. What it gets touted as is keeps freezing up on me there. The Red Army versus the White Army. The Red Army, which is always connected with communism and stuff, that was Lenin and Trotsky. Trotsky became his right-hand man that helped organize and navigate all of this. The White Army was the provisional government. Now, the provisional government had U.S. support, but as well as a much European support. However, that, didn't translate into success in them winning ultimately. So within the war, one of the first goals was to get Russia out of the war. And he was able to actually sign a peace treaty with Germany. So Russia bows out of the war before World War I was fully over. The other thing that happened during the Civil War is in 1918, there was an attempt on Lenin's life. And this led to the Bolsheviks becoming a lot more violent and authoritarian. They ended up executing, there was some violence, there was some threats and stuff like that, but the authoritarian streak emerged after an attempt on his life. They executing, this problem with talking and trying to write. They executed over 500 people. Besides that, they started, it ends up being called an iron dictatorship. They end up taking over complete control of the economy, as well as creating a type of military discipline. And not only how the government was run, but how the people were treated. And with the economic control, ultimately set up trade as a state monopoly. So again, none of this was what he originally had talked about doing as far as running stuff, but it ended up being what helped them be successful in winning the Civil War and then ultimately taking over. And once he took over, he maintained a lot of this more dictatorship qualities. Like, so it's not like this was only because of war and then it went away. This ended up becoming part of the norm for government structure, which then Stalin took to another level. They reinstituted the death penalty in the army for desertion. And that was in part because there were people that thought he was going too far and didn't like it. He drafted people into the Red Army. So not only were you drafted in whether you wanted, but if you tried to desert, then you were executed. And then ultimately benefited from letting the peasants confiscate land, because people then became afraid to oppose the Bolsheviks for fear that they would take their land. Where they didn't, we'll see Stalin becomes a master of propaganda. Lenin was not massively big on propaganda. And they weren't really strong in political control or even the methods of politics that were being used at that time. It was more of this, dictatorship force that allowed them to firmly take over control of a region of Russia during the Civil War. The other thing is he had Trotsky, who was running the military, which allowed him to effectively use what they did have. And they had advantages over the White Army. And the reality is that many didn't believe that the Red Army had a chance, that Lenin ultimately was going to come out victorious, because the White Army under the provisional government had European support. But again, that translated into very little long term. So one, of course, would be the human resources or people. Because of the draft and forced military participation, and then the threat of the death penalty if you deserted, they had a large military. They also had the military hardware and technology that was from World War I that Russia had been starting to produce. This was stuff that they had confiscated, left by the imperial army. And the White Army largely didn't get most of that equipment, which didn't help them. They also they had the central position geographically. So the White Army was scattered throughout Russia, and the Red Army actually held a central position, which was connected to not only mobilization, which allowed them to get around Russia, but allowed for supplies and trade with outside forces, as well as the factory and industrial production. They ended up, and railroads, they ended up controlling a lot of these areas, which helped, and again, in mobilization and financing the military and being able to move into territory to fight the White Army and be successful, notwithstanding, of course, then the weaponry. All of this, the White Army or White Movement was the largest group that tried to stop the Soviet government. And again, they did have and why people thought the White Army was going to win is that most of the officers that had fought in World War I and were established military officials were part of the White Army. But these benefits of human resources, central position, and military hardware ultimately gave them an advantage, and then the strict authoritarian control. The reality is that that people were scared of them, and the fact that they were willing to impose such strict, harsh structure on the people, where the provisional government did not, allowed for the ability to move people and have them do what you wanted where the provisional government constantly faltered with support, with soldiers fighting, getting supplies. They were poorly equipped compared, and didn't have the coordination in battles that the Red Army did. So ultimately, Lenin won, and ends up taking over control of Russia, which was just like it was it was a shock to everyone, just like it's going to be a shock with Stalin when he makes the non-aggression pact later in World War II. It became a shock to the rest of the world that Lenin actually won and the provisional government fell, which was very disappointing to the United States, as they'd hoped to push the more democratic government system in Russia. So by the spring of 1920, the Civil War was almost done, and for most purposes, Lenin had control of Russia. When they were finally fully defeated, it wasn't all easy going. He did have problems with food. And a drop in productivity. There was a famine that took place, so he did have problems. We'll say here, we'll put them in here. Famine, industrial productivity, the realization that this utopia he wanted wasn't going to happen. There really was a belief that the Marxist ideology would create this utopia in Russia. And after realizing all the problems, and of course the requirement and shift that he had to become this kind of strict, brutal authoritarian in some cases, shattered that type of dream. And so he decided that he would have to try to create his own utopia a different way. And so he created the USSR, right, which was the United Soviet Socialist Republic. And so you have the birth of the Soviet Union. And that was meant to be a federation of independent nations that would join together. And in his vision, you'd have this initial group of independent nations. So here was his vision, right? Is that the USSR would be independent nations that would willingly join together. Right, and that's not going to be the case. There's going to be a lot of forced joining that takes place. And this would spread revolution and social change. And then that would lead to expansion. Naturally, right? Through revolutions, through the people, rather than through forced military expansion and control. What happens ultimately with Lenin as he gets older, he suffers a stroke, and then he has a steady decline in his health. During all of this, he had an individual named Stalin who had risen up the ranks and was a close advisor. Trotsky was still a closer advisor. And initially, Stalin and Lenin were pretty close, but so Stalin was an advisor, and moved up the ranks when Lenin was in power and controlling the Soviet Union. However, as his health declined, Lenin began to question Stalin's loyalty. And he looked more towards Trotsky. Now, we don't know exactly, what happened fully, but that there was a belief that Trotsky was supposed to be the successor to Lenin. The problem that happened is as Lenin became sick, Stalin used propaganda, which he was a master at. He stayed close to Lenin, had pictures taken, and is going to create posters and everything else after his death to try to showcase, right, that they were close. So that he can claim, what he's going to claim is that Stalin, or that Lenin wanted him to take over. Whereas Trotsky was, unfortunately for him, even though many believe that he was supposed to be the legitimate successor, he was not present, was out of town, and missed the funeral, because what happened is that Stalin telegraphed him and said the funeral's going to happen right away. There's no point in you trying to get back in time because you wouldn't make it. And this was powerful symbolism when Stalin's there with the procession of this grand, massive funeral for Lenin, which people loved Lenin, even with his brutality. Many people loved Lenin. Stalin's there by the casket, giving the speeches, and Trotsky's nowhere to be seen. And ultimately, there is suggestion that Lenin had actually suggested that Stalin be removed from the Central Committee that was part of the government organization, but they ended up voting to allow Stalin to stay because Stalin had made agreements with some of the key players, and this allows him to eventually finally take over, where then Trotsky ends up being assassinated, and Stalin then fully declares himself leader of the Soviet Union. I wanted to show these, and then that's going to lead us into World War II. The last few pictures we have here. Here's young Lenin in his younger years, and then here's Lenin when he was older. This was Leon Trotsky. Again, the right-hand man that ends up kind of getting shafted by Stalin. This is Lenin with protests against the provisional government, and you can see Trotsky down here. One of the things that Stalin does, again, brilliantly with propaganda, is that after Lenin's death, he tries, when Lenin was sick and then after his death, Stalin tries to showcase himself as really close to Lenin. He actually, early days of Photoshop, removes Trotsky from this position here so that he tried to make it look like Trotsky was never close to Lenin. And then eventually he removes his association with Lenin to have it fully centralized on Stalin. But this is where Lenin thrived and was strong, was the whole proposition of the slogan with his four main goals that really resonated with the people and led to the protest against provisional government and ultimately the Civil War with peace, land, and bread. And then you have, here's it at his death. Stalin had him embalmed and displayed in public. He was placed in Moscow's Red Square, where a shrine was made to him, and that people could come visit him. And then the poster here is the best example of that propaganda that Stalin used to solidify his control. Is showcasing him and Stalin right here, right, and then Lenin looking like best buds, working hand in hand for the future of the Soviet Union. So you remove Trotsky from the picture, literally, and then put yourself in these propaganda posters that puts you side by side with Lenin to gain legitimacy. And this is ultimately how Stalin is able to solidify his control and takeover, when all signs suggest that that was not Lenin's intent. All right, so that's where we're going to end there. It brings us perfectly to what we'll see then when we talk about Stalin and the Soviet Union and their position within World War II.